in 2016, a new president will be coming in January and facing a very divided country and an awful lot of problems that await in that in-basket. And I think Anne-Marie would agree that those problems can't be solved by a president alone, but they will be in the next president's lap. Anne-Marie Slaughter is the CEO of New America, which is a think tank that's based in Washington, D.C., but has some great friends here in the Bay Area and in Silicon Valley. Before taking on that role of leading that organization, she was director of policy planning in the State Department. And as you all know, that's the sort of think tank part, so that's the deep policy part of the State Department. And prior to that, was dean of the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. Now, I first knew Anne-Marie when she was at Harvard Law School doing research on a networked world, which she was predicting and trying to help us understand back in the 1990s. And so I'm gonna, and you probably all know Anne-Marie, not just for her foreign policy chops and international law chops, but for the work she has done on the role of women. And that seminal article that argued that women can't quite have it all. So that then led to the book.
But just not yet.
Yeah, don't have it all. That's right. So I'm going to ask you, just to set the table before we get into what will face the president, give us a sense of what the international order looked like 70 years ago. It was being built by Western leaders. How that might be changing, what remains the same, but how that might need to change to adapt to a very different world.
Great. So thank you. And I have to start by saying how pleased I am to be here. I've spoken at the World Affairs Council here a number of times. And when Jane asks me if I want to do something, I try very hard to say yes. And I know you all know, but you have a treasure in your leader. I won't say a national treasure because it makes you sound like some kind of monument. But, but I do want to just start by making, by saying that and making sure you all know that. So I think this is a fascinating moment in terms of how the global system is changing. So if you go back to 1947, you have what I call a chessboard. You have the world of governments, what I think of as Henry Kissinger's world, the world of statecraft, where it is essentially, there are a certain number of nations in the world. There were 50-odd in 1945. There are 200-odd now. But if you look at the states that we think about most in the State Department, you're probably still at about 50 states that you really have to constantly pay attention to. And international relations is a question of, I'm a government. If I do this, that government will do that, and I need to anticipate that. That's chess or poker. There are other, but it's essentially statecraft. When we think about it, we generally talk about some kind of game. That world is not going away. I do not believe that the state is withering away. I do think cities are becoming much more important. I'll talk about that, but it is very hard for me to imagine any other way of organizing 7 billion people than states, however imperfect they may be. So I don't think states are going away, and I don't think statecraft is going away. That next president, she's got China, Russia,
She.
Oh. Okay, now is the time for me to say New America is nonpartisan. We have Republicans and Democrats chairing our board, so that was a personal slip. Anyway, the next president will face China, Russia, Iran, still has to think very much in terms of statecraft. But here's what's happening and is going to grow increasingly. The world is a chessboard, but it's also a web. So it is that world of states. But now just think about the internet, or think about a map of the world at night, right? With all the lights and the networks, or think about a digital map of the world. That's a world of networks. And that world has been steadily rising. And yes, I started working on government-to-government networks in 1994. But it is now at a point where if you are a business leader, a nonprofit leader, a university leader, anyone who is active in something that is global. And increasingly, that can be very small businesses, not just big businesses, and small nonprofits, not just big nonprofits. You are part of the web of global relations. So going forward, and I will say I have a book coming out called The Chessboard and the Web, but if you are a member of the web, you are equally important now to solving global problems. If you look at the Paris Agreement, you've got lots of governments, but for the first time, you have what the Paris governments called non-party stakeholders. That meant the 7,000 cities around the world who've made commitments to reduce their emissions. That meant thousands of businesses who are part of those commitments and thousands of NGOs who are monitoring those commitments. And for the first time, they have a formal status in the Paris Agreement. So going forward, you're going to have statecraft and webcraft. You're going to be building strategic networks and figuring out how to run them and how to tap their capacity and how to combine them with governments. And you're going to need both to face the problems we face.
Now, when you think about the factors that are driving this change, with technology, the demographic change, to what degree are those same trends shaping our politics today and contributing to some of the divisions we're seeing? Are we in a sort of transitional phase? Say something about the connection between that analysis and what the president, what this campaign has felt like. What's been revealed during it?
So I do think there's some profound similarities, and I just should have added the web groups who have figured out how to make networks, they're the criminals, right? We're accustomed to terrorist networks, money laundering networks, arms trafficking networks, human trafficking networks. They've got this. It's up to us to figure out how to build the counter networks. But here's where I think there's a similarity. The empowerment of all those web actors is a function of digital technology and globalization more generally, right? It is now possible, if you think about ISIL, or frankly, if you think about an NGO who wants to network with its counterparts, you create a web platform, and suddenly, as we keep reading, individuals, whether they're in Egypt or the United States or China, have enormous agency, right? That's the term we use, right? The increase in the ability of any individual to make a difference in the world. Thomas Friedman wrote about the super empowered individual in the Lexus and the olive tree in around 2000, and it's just gotten stronger since. But we haven't yet figured out how to make that individual a part of something positive and meaningful and with impact. And so if you connect that to national politics, that's a lot of what you're seeing. A lot of individuals who are really angry and who have now the ability to make themselves heard and to find each other and to connect with each other. What we haven't done as a national government on the right and the left, because remember, we're looking at Donald Trump now, but Bernie Sanders supporters were as angry in many ways with the Democratic establishment as Donald Trump's supporters are with the Republican establishment. So on both sides, you've got people who have the agency to be angry and voice their dissatisfaction, but don't yet have the structures to turn that anger into positive action.
So as the next president faces a big challenge, a bit of a crisis of legitimacy. Part of the voting public, maybe a large part of the voting public, will see that president as either illegitimate or unfit.
Yes.
Right? In order to regain the trust of the American people, won't it be important to get stuff done in certain areas quickly? And I can't help but think about an area that surely has bipartisan interest, and that's the jobs challenge. Can you talk a little bit about how the nature of work is changing and will change, in part as a result of technology, and then we'll move on to trade?
Yep. These questions are just sort of a rundown of exactly why the next president is going to have, I won't say an impossible job, but an extremely difficult one. So I think a large part of what you're seeing in terms of the division in the country is exactly this, yeah, it's all talk, right? That's what Donald Trump keeps saying to Secretary Clinton, right? It's all talk. Sounds good, no action. And we have large parts of this country who've been hearing talk for a long time, back to the 70s, right? But their standard of living is going down as they watch other people's go up. And now they've got both men and women working, right? They've held level because their wives have gone to work, but they're barely holding on. So she's got to do, or he has to do something that is really demonstrates action. I think the first thing you will see is a large infrastructure projects. And again, I mean, this is actually where I wish earmarks were back. Earmarks did us a lot of good, right? How did you constitute a coalition? You went to individual members of the House and the Senate and said, okay, this bridge will be built, in your district. And there's a whole body of literature that says that's a problem. But I do think, just given the state of our infrastructure, and I live on Amtrak, this is not a recipe for happiness, I have to tell you. I mean, it breaks down constantly. It's constantly late. It doesn't break down because of snow. It breaks down because it's cold. You can kind of anticipate cold every year, really. And I sit there and I'm not sure what I'm more unhappy about, the state of our infrastructure or the seeming acceptance of my fellow passengers compared to the Europeans, the Japanese, the Chinese. But I do think there is a way to stitch together major work on infrastructure. And then I think, the biggest question we all face, and again, this from right to left, is in the digital revolution, we're at the equivalent of 1830 in the Industrial Revolution. So by 1830, the steam engine had been discovered, you had railroads, but it was just the beginning, and steamboats, just a few though, if you actually go back. By 1890, the United States, Western Europe were unrecognizable, right? So you had all the steam, then you have electricity, and of course then later the internal combustion engine. We're just at the beginning. We've seen what digital technology can do for the information industry. We haven't touched it for transport, for agriculture, for the more traditional sectors of the economy. And the great question we're all facing, and New America and Bloomberg Beta are actually looking at the future of work, workers, and technology. Some people predict 9% of jobs will be automated. Other people predict 41% of jobs will be automated, and those are white-collar jobs. Those are jobs that we studied for, like litigation. I was a law professor for many years. A huge amount of what lawyers do now can be done by machine learning. Or we're already seeing that in medicine, and then all accounting, all routine jobs that require intelligence and training, but are relatively routine. So we have to start thinking now, okay, what's the social safety net look like for that world? And that's, again, where you've got libertarians and technologists worrying about that because they know that you can't sustain a society with this degree of inequality. So maybe we end up with universal basic income, or maybe we end up with a very different social safety net than we have now. But that's something where the next president can't answer those questions, but I would appoint a national commission. I'd have Republicans and Democrats, technologists and others, union leaders, really thinking through, all right, what are the policies we have to put in place that would be relevant to whatever scenario? Because we can't predict, but we can say we are in for the same kind of change we were in 1830. And just last thing, remember, the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, that brought us Marxism, right? That upheaval, that's where Marxism came from. And then from Marxism to fascism. So these kinds of social disruptions turn into economic disruptions, turn into political disruptions.
So as you think about that, you touched on the role of technology in driving this and what are the risks politically and socially. What does this mean for the next president's approach to trade? TPP has been criticized by both candidates.
So let me start by saying, I do not think Secretary Clinton's change on TPP was as opportunistic as many people paint it, for the following reason. When I was in the State Department, I was completely for TPP. I mean, if you were looking at our policy toward Asia, we don't have that many cards, and you've got a lot of countries in Asia that are very worried about China, but they're also worried about the United States getting too aggressive toward China. So Lee Kuan Yew, when he was still alive, was, we want you here, but we don't want you here rattling sabers, because that's going to create dynamics we don't want. So in that world, what have we got? Well, trade was a huge piece of what we had. I was totally supportive of TPP, and so was Secretary Clinton. When I left the administration and went back to Princeton and then went to New America, I looked at my tech people. I looked at my economic policy people. A lot of them were very skeptical. And they were skeptical not because of an overall stance on free trade, but because they really questioned whether this agreement was as inclusive as it needs to be. So just to start, I really do think she actually, once she started campaigning, started looking at this from a different point of view. More broadly, and I understand that what I'm about to say is heresy in the Church of Free Trade in which I grew up, I really do think we have to have a new conversation about trade. I am all for free trade in theory. I know about Ricardo. I get the expanded pie. But all of that assumes you redistribute enough to preserve a political consensus for free trade. And we do not have that. And we cannot keep saying, and here I'll say as a Democrat, it is just not good enough to say, well, we'll elevate labor standards and environmental standards, and we'll retrain you. You have people all over this country saying, forget that. Retraining doesn't work. We are the losers, and we're steadily the losers. And the people who are capturing the gains from trade are too small a slice of our society. So we need to have a real national conversation, again, right and left. And you got people on the right and people on the left who are saying this is not good enough. And, you know, there are times economic models work in theory, but they don't work in practice, and we have to turn to something that is fairer trade. And again, I don't want to, you know, we don't want to go back to tariffs, we don't want to go back to mercantilism, I get that. But unless we have a trading system that does what John Ruggie once called embedded liberalism, meaning you embed economic and social protections domestically, and that's what supports free trade, unless we have that, we're not going to get free trade agreements, and frankly, I'm not sure we should.
We've talked about areas where both domestic and international, where there's an element of choice, but there's I think of the big issue that the next president is going to be faced with, regardless of what that person would like to be doing on day one. The big issue is Syria.
Yes.
And one of the changes in the way the international order has looked at itself is in this notion of responsibility to protect, which you're a real scholar of and an advocate of, and you know, that's the notion that states have an obligation to protect their citizens from mass atrocities, and if they fail, the international community has the right, if not maybe the responsibility, to intervene. When Syria began, lots of folks in government were arguing we should intervene quickly. Since then, the foreign fighters have come in. Russia is playing the role that it's playing. So what are the real options that face the next president when he or she comes in?
So Syria, we could spend the entire rest of our time talking about Syria and depress ourselves utterly. So let me start by saying Syria is a great example of where I think you need to think about it through the lens of both the chessboard and the web, because I was strongly supportive of intervening in Syria as early as February 2012, and remember the marches started in March of 2011. The Syrian people marched and got shot at for 6 months. They didn't start fighting back until November of 2011, and then in February of 2012, we took it to the Security Council. The Russians vetoed it. The Russians then said to Assad, basically, you got 3 months to wipe out these people, and then we'll mop it up. Assad couldn't do it. It's gotten worse steadily since then. If you looked at this fight through the lens of geopolitics, the president's position is very understandable. It's very much like Jim Baker in the Balkans. We don't have a dog in this fight. Israel's okay, Saudi Arabia's okay, Turkey's okay, Really, this is a domestic uprising. There is no reason for the United States to really get involved. And geopolitically, you could just say we're going to contain it. If you look at it from the point of view of the web, you could see very early that this leader would do anything to stay in power. He made that very clear. He started by torturing children, and he was willing to shoot unarmed demonstrators. He'd learned the lesson from Egypt that said, nope, I'm just going to keep cracking down. And so you could see two things. One, you could already see that he'd released all the Islamic extremists in his jails, and he wanted it to become Al-Qaeda or ISIL now versus him, because that kept him in power. And two, you could see that people were not going to stay around while he was pulverizing their cities. So from the web perspective, you could see terrorist networks and you could see refugees. And you could then project that destabilizes all the countries around, as it has: Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, which is none too stable to begin with. And then, of course, beyond that, Europe. And you could see that ungoverned spaces like this, and if you don't help the moderates, the extremists take over, which has also happened. So that's the sort of backdrop. This is why at every turn I've said, we have to act, it's going to get worse. We have to act, it's going to get worse. It's gotten steadily worse. But as you now point out, it's gotten so much worse that there are moderates on the battlefield. We are helping them, but they are completely outnumbered by a vast array of various kinds of Islamist groups, and not just ISIL, and not just Jabhat al-Nusra, but lots of others that are less extreme than those two, but not exactly people we'd want to govern. So what do you do? I think our only hope, and I'm not all that optimistic, I think it's quite possible we're going to look at something across the Middle East that looks like the 16-year Lebanese civil war, and just with terrible consequences for Europe, for the region, ultimately for us. I also think we're incubating a new generation of terrorists against us. But the play that Secretary Clinton has at least said she will try is to make clear that we are willing to use force against the Syrian government. We are willing to defend a no-fly zone. If I were advising her, I'd say the next time he pulverizes a city or whatever else he does in Aleppo, we crater his runways so that he has to stop barrel bombing people. Not to win the war, but to say there is a limit to how you can win this war. He's still using chemical weapons. And at that point, I don't think Russia wants to keep fighting if we're willing to put a thumb on the scale on the side of civilians. I think Russia wants a deal. I think Iran ultimately wants a deal. And then you get a political deal. Now, a political deal is going to be incredibly fragile. If we think the Balkans peace was fragile, that's going to make that look robust. But we have to stop the killing. Because until you do that, you really can't move. So what I would advise doing is, if John Kerry has no levers, he's got carrots and no sticks. And he's said that. So we need sticks, and we actually need to be really tough. There's a Cuban Missile Crisis element to this too, where we look at the Russians and we say, no, there's a limit. Just because you're there doesn't mean we won't fly planes. We're not going to be so scared of an incident with you that we just let you have the field. Because Putin will, you give him an inch, he'll take 5 miles. So that would be my advice. I think Secretary Clinton has made clear she thinks we do have to be, in her words, more muscular. If Donald Trump is elected, I really have no idea. I don't think he'd do that, right? He's basically been saying that he wouldn't object to the Russian leadership role in the Middle East, and then all bets are off.
Well, let's stay with U.S.-Russia for a moment, because in fact, the two candidates couldn't be more different.
Yes.
And so as you think about that, I mean, both Syria's at stake, but that's not all that's at stake. We've got Ukraine, we've got cybersecurity, and the attacks on Americans' emails and websites. What should be the next president's kind of going-in approach to Russia? Both beyond Syria as well, to the overall relationship?
Again, it's not pretty, and I think particularly if Secretary Clinton is elected, you can expect Putin to challenge her very early, both because he doesn't like her and frankly because she's a woman, right? And other nations will challenge her too. New presidents get challenged. The first woman will absolutely get challenged. And so I think you can expect an unpleasant incident early on. Two things. One, we do have to remember that Putin is following a playbook that was invented by the czars. So, in the dinosaur years when I was in college, certainly my sons think that, I studied Soviet politics and Russian history. And all the way back for centuries, when czars got into trouble at home, they invented a foreign enemy, or created a foreign enemy. You didn't have to just invent one. And that is exactly what Putin's doing. His economy is weak. He's personally popular, but his party is not. There is rampant corruption. He's lost a lot of the sort of upper middle class urban elites who used to be with him. And so it absolutely suits him to say, we are once again bestriding the global stage, and the United States has to deal with us, and they are coming at us. So you have to remember, though, he's negotiating from weakness, and you have to basically keep turning the economic screws. And also, again, if Russia starts losing, either in Ukraine or in Syria, to the extent that Russian soldiers are dying, he's got very little tolerance for body bags going home. When that started happening in Ukraine, he dialed it down in Ukraine very quickly. So I think you've got to be simultaneously resolute and making clear that you are not going to be bullied, but at the same time, you don't want to assume that he's really an enormous threat. He's fighting from weakness, and there are ways to actually play on that.
So let's go to Libya for a moment, because there's a place where Russia acquiesced to the approach that NATO took. And it is an example of responsibility to protect. But that morphed quickly into regime change. Yep. What are the lessons of Libya, not for us, but for Putin? What lessons did he draw?
So I'm thinking, if I were Susan Rice, I would now give you 20 minutes on how Putin knew exactly what he was getting into in Libya. She has no patience with the idea that the Russians didn't understand what they were agreeing to. But to be fair to Putin, although I do support responsibility to protect, and I interpret that, though, again, as a strategic doctrine that says in a completely interconnected web world, we can't afford to let governments massacre their own citizens. It's not a humanitarian position, it's a strategic position. It says the consequences of letting governments do that are profoundly dangerous, and we globally have got to intervene earlier rather than later because we will suffer. Not just because those people are suffering. But I think Libya was not well done, right? And I would also argue, and a number of states have argued, that you can't intervene to stop a government from massacring its own people if that's going to mean the overthrow of that government. And in Libya, Gaddafi was just going to keep massacring people, and so very quickly it turned into we're going after Gaddafi. You can't do that unless you've got forces for the day after. And we didn't. And actually, I've just finished Alter Egos by Mark Landler on Secretary Clinton and Obama, and people said, wait a minute, we're going to need forces for the day after, and neither the Europeans nor we were interested in providing those. So to be fair to Putin, you can say, wait a minute, overturning Gaddafi and creating an entire country that where ISIL or Al-Qaeda can root and that also destabilizes Mali and the rest of northern Africa, that wasn't a good idea. That's fair to Putin. What is not fair is to say that means that we should simply ignore a government that is determined to do anything necessary to stay in power. And just to go back, the earliest example of this is Hitler, right? Human rights was born in part understanding that had we paid attention around Kristallnacht, we wouldn't necessarily have gotten all the way to 1945. That was a government that was willing to do whatever it took to get to power and stay in power, and that we had those early warning signs, and ultimately, of course, that led to World War. What we're looking at now in a Rwanda or a Syria is the destabilization of an entire region, and then, of course, terrorist networks, refugee streams, other things that imperil all of us.
Speaking of the day after, we're watching Mosul play out in Iraq, and then of course there'll be Raqqa presumably. If you assume that, as certainly I do, that the coalition forces backed by American air power will prevail in both of those cities, then what? Won't the same sectarian divide that allowed those cities to fall to ISIS still be there?
Yeah. Let me give you the realistic short-term answer, and then since we are at the 70th anniversary, I'll project what I'd like to see or what I would actually predict 70 years hence. So right now, we can destroy the territorial caliphate. And that is what we're doing, right? We can drive ISIL out of Mosul, then Raqqa. We've already driven them out of Dabiq. Dabiq is an extremely strategic city for them because that's where the apocalypse is supposed to happen. Their magazine is called Dabiq. And we can drive them out of those cities. They're already telling their followers, well, you know, this territory is not so as important as we said it is. You know, the caliphate is virtual. They're already preparing for that next phase. What we can't do is actually provide good government in those areas. We're addressing the symptoms, not the cause. Right? We cannot create either in Mosul or Raqqa or more in Iraq more broadly or in Syria more broadly or in Saudi Arabia. We can't create the kinds of governments that are allowing millions of young people opportunity and a future and a decently governed country, whether it's a democracy or not. So what we're going to do is this is a battle. It's not the war. This is tactical, right? So we drive them out, but we know they're going to come back. They'll either come back into those same cities, as has happened, or the Iraqis and the Syrians and the Kurds will hold those cities and they'll regroup in other places. Long term, the only way to actually be able to act effectively, because we have learned that sending US troops or European troops or any foreign troops doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. We're not going to do that again. But really, if you look back 70 years, the UN expected to have a global army, right? In 1945, in the UN Charter, there's a whole provision for a global army. Well, that didn't work, right? Nations quickly said, no, we're not going to do that. We'll send peacekeepers, but we're not going to have a global army. Looking forward, we need, and it probably will be national and then you accumulate it at global forces that are combined of some military, a lot of police, constabulary forces, development people, and political people. You need integrated forces that can actually, and under a global lens, not US forces, but you'll have national versions of this, where you can go into a place like Raqqa and you can actually say, and again, you're global, so you can't say this is the West, you can then start to build the foundations of security and economic development that we know how to do, but takes a long time and can't be done without basic security. So I think that's where longer term we're going to have to go to be able to handle these kinds of situations.
Now, two of the questioners who sent up cards have brought up another transnational danger with which to deal, and that's climate change.
Yes.
Donald Trump has said one of his first acts in office will be to sign an executive order pulling us out of the Paris Accord. Presumably, Secretary Clinton would like to stay in. What will it take, if we do stay in, what would it take to meet the obligations under that accord? By way of technology investment and other things. And then secondly, what would be the impact of withdrawing?
So this is, again, where thinking about the web world is so interesting. Because let's assume Donald Trump did do that, and he pulled us out of the Paris Agreement. Cities representing 80% of the world's population and an enormous percentage of the global GDP, it's again somewhere between 70 and 80%, have signed on. So he can pull out. New York, Chicago, San Francisco, LA, all those cities are still going to make carbon commitments to cut carbon, and those commitments will be part of the Paris Agreement because they're cities and they need to, and the Chinese cities too. So then what will happen is there'll be a suit brought to the Supreme Court that says the executive has the foreign affairs power. Can the executive prohibit cities from doing something that is in their interest? It's not legally binding. It's not legally binding in international law. That they can't do. But can they do it as the power of a mayor on the global stage? And it's going to be really hard. Well, we don't know what the Supreme Court will look like, but I think it's going to be very hard for a Supreme Court to say no, because how else can mayors, and again, Republican mayors as well as Democrat mayors, actually do what they need to do to improve life for their citizens? So this is an example of where, sure, on the chessboard he can pull out, but I don't think he can actually stop the agreement from taking hold.
So climate change is an issue, or addressing it is an issue that isn't just about states, right?
Not at all.
It'll be about business, it'll be about people.
Mayors, NGOs, sub-state and non-state.
Yeah, and so I'd argue that cybersecurity is another case in point. There's a place where technology has gotten out ahead of social innovation. We don't yet have a regime for or a set of rules of the road. Talk a little bit about the need for the president to address that issue, but also who else has to be at the table, both for developing the norms, but also for execution.
Exactly. This is what's called a foreign affairs workout. We're going right across the range of issues. So cybersecurity is exactly, again, it's an intergovernmental issue and it's a web issue. So intergovernmentally, think about the North Korean hack of Sony, right? That was effectively an act of aggression by one state against another. And although Sony was hit, the US government responded. I don't know the details of how they responded. They don't want us to know the details of how they responded, but I know we responded. And there was actually something reported about a couple months later, something going on in North Korea. I know we made it really clear to the North Koreans, you do that again and we'll shut down every system you have. So, and similarly, right now, we also, our attack, Stuxnet on Iran, that was an attack by Israel and the United States on Iran. So you have those kinds of issues that are really intergovernmental. But then you have, how do we protect the American people against manipulation with our voting, against the possibility that somebody scrambles our banks, against the possibility that people take down our grid? That can't be handled just government to government. You can try to deter, but fundamentally that's a matter of security in the sense of resilience, in the sense of protection. And to do that, the government, again, has to plug into vast networks of corporate leaders, of universities, of hospitals, of electricity, of power companies. Think about all the different pieces, and we have to be able to mobilize those networks, but also give them the means they need, but also draw on what they have, right? Apple's got better encryption probably than the NSA, or at least it's probably neck and neck. And so we have to, again, combine those state actors with those web actors in ways that really is a different kind of foreign policy. It's a kind of foreign policy that in 1945, you just didn't have to think about convening all those actors or using them systematically.
So these problems that require us all also require our coming to a shared view of who we are and what we stand for. And you started by describing a world very much changed by technology and demography. What does that mean about coming to grips with who we are?
So again, if I said in the Industrial Revolution, we're at about, in the Digital Revolution, we're at the equivalent of 1830 in the Industrial Revolution. That's an enormous change. But equally, as Eric Liu, who runs the Civic Collaboratory, has written, he wrote this great article on democracy where he said, being American is slowly, agonizingly, but inexorably being decoupled from being white. That means by 2050, for the first time since 1600 or whatever you want to date the Americas as without Native Americans, which is not fair, but the political America. For those 400 years, longer, to be American has meant to be white, and anybody who's not white gets a hyphen. Well, by 2050, I'll be a European American. When the world looks at what an American is, it will be somebody of color. That is an enormous transformation. It's an enormous transformation for us, and we're used to massive transformations. That's not going to happen quite as fast in Europe, but it's happening in Europe too. I'm half Belgian. The Belgium I grew up in was all white, and the Brussels I go to today is definitely not. Look at London, land in Heathrow. Look at who is admitting you in Heathrow. So these are massive demographic shifts. And it's impossible to imagine that they don't create the kind of anger and dislocation we see. And indeed, again, in the 19th century, we had huge anti-immigrant movements, and they were against Russian and German and Irish immigrants, right? And whom we didn't count as white. So we're in for a bumpy road. But I am optimistic because, I wrote a book in 2007 called The Idea That Is America, Keeping Faith with Our Values in a Dangerous World. And what I said, and I was born in Charlottesville, like it doesn't get more American history than that. Mr. Jefferson strides the streets. You're expecting to see him at any moment. I mean, you really are steeped in it. And, Virginia thinks it invented this country. So, but I look at that and I say, what makes America America is not that we're better than other people. It's that we have a set of values that hold us together, because that's all we've got. We've got the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address and I Have a Dream. We have these documents. We don't have race. We don't have shared history. We don't have ethnicity or religion. What we have is that we constantly fall short of those values, but then the system is constructed so that we have room for people to stand up, like African Americans today, like women, like Native Americans, whoever it is, to say, hey, you said we're supposed to be equal. We're not. And then we have to respond. And I am enormously proud to think that I live in a country that will reflect the world. And I'm enormously proud when I look at the Olympic teams and I say, look at us. We look like Africa. We look like East Asia. We look like South Asia. We look like Latin America. That is a country that you can be proud of. And I think it's going to be really hard to get there and lots of upheaval, but I am confident we will. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Anne-Marie.